This video reviews some common clause structures in sentences. So we'll look at those patterns, we'll talk about the role of a conjunction and some basic types of conjunctions like coordinating and subordinating. So one common clause structure pattern is to have a dependent clause first and then an independent clause. So after Susan voted, it has a subject and a verb, but it can't stand alone. When dependent clauses come first, has a subject and a verb, but can't stand alone. Those are dependent. And the usual pattern is, when those dependent clauses come first, we put a comma between the clauses. Another structure pattern is an independent clause and then a dependent clause second, as in, because I have gained so much from it, or when the dependent clause is second. In this example, we usually do not put a comma between the two, no punctuation at all. There are exceptions, but that's the general pattern. A third common clause structure pattern is when you have two independent clauses joined together. And there's a variety of ways to do that. We can use a comma and a coordinating conjunction. We can use a semicolon. We could use a dash. Or we could use a colon, among others. In all of these examples, both the first and second clause would make sense all by themselves. The last possible type is to have two dependent clauses. And this is a fragment, never a sentence. All sentences must have at least one independent clause. That's why sometimes they're called the main clause. When we talk about clauses, it helps to talk about conjunctions, because that's how they are joined together. So conjunctions join together clauses. The word because here joins together these two clauses, or the word when, or the word but. And it's also possible that conjunctions signify which clause is subordinate. So here we have a clause in front, and the word after tells you that after Susan voted is the dependent clause, and she ate a piece of pie is the main clause. The word when tells you that when dependent clauses come first is the subordinate clause, and you should use a comma is the main clause. So the conjunctions will either be in the middle between the clauses, or at the beginning of the dependent clauses. Here are the steps to identify the clause structure of a sentence. Step 1. Identify all of the subjects and predicates. Each unique pair is a clause. Now you might have compound subjects and predicates in there to trip you up a little bit. Some other tips. Let punctuation guide you. If there's commas in the middle, that's a good place to recognize one clause ends and another begins in many cases. You can look for the fanboys. If you've never heard this mnemonic device, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so, those are the coordinating conjunctions that we see just about always. I don't think any other coordinating conjunctions exist other than the fanboys. And finally, we can look for subordinating conjunctions at the beginning of dependent clauses. So once you have identified all of your subjects and your predicates, next, we're going to decide if each clause is independent or dependent. Some questions to ask yourself are, can the clause stand alone? Does it make sense all by itself? If the answer is yes to both of these questions, then it's an independent clause, or IC. If the answer is no, then it's a dependent clause, or DC. Mitch lives, that's the subject and the predicate. Burglary happened. So there are two clauses here. It turns out there is a conjunction there, the word where, and this is an independent and then a dependent clause. Because if you said, where the burglary happened, something is missing. It's not a standalone sentence. I emphasize the commas because they were a little bit hard to see. Here in number 12, we see we were worried, and then we did want. The comma there is a great clue where one clause ends and another begins. And we have this subordinating conjunction, the word although, so this one is DCIC. List was announced, Kelly ran. Notice the comma, notice the subordinating conjunction, DCIC. 14, we watched, archaeologists dug up. That's sort of a phrasal verb, dug up. We have this subordinating conjunction as, ICDC. In the next several, this is a dependent clause, and then an independent, dependent, independent, independent, dependent, dependent, independent, dependent, independent, dependent, independent. A few more examples. We have John threw and brother caught, and these are joined with a comma and one of the fanboys, and both clauses stand alone. So this is I see, I see. This last example, even though it seems like a longer sentence, we have I forgot. We have a series of prepositional phrases, but it's still just one independent clause. A similar sentence, we have Bill ran, threw, and dove. How many clauses are here? There's 3 verbs or 3 predicates, but there's still only one subject. So this whole thing is one independent clause.